Hi! It is story time again with me, Mrs. Obojanowska. We are reading our class novel, Boy at the Back of the Class. We are on chapter 7. I hope you're ready for this one. 7 and 8, if I can squeeze them in. Mr. Irons' Nose. When the bell rung for the first break the next morning, Mrs. Khan kept her promise and let the new boy out into the playground for the very first time. Tom was put in charge of looking after him, and we were all told that if he got scared or wanted to stop playing, then we were to find a teacher immediately or go and see Mrs. Hemsey in the staff room. I didn't know why the new boy would be scared of being in the playground or why he wouldn't want to play with us, but then I thought that maybe in his country the bullies had been mean to him at school too. I'd never really thought about it before, but maybe there are bullies in everyone's playgrounds. As Josie grabbed her football, Tom tried to explain to the new boy how to play the game properly. "You, like this," said Tom loudly, pointing to the new boy, and then his foot and then the ball. The new boy nodded. "But not like this," continued Tom, shaking his head before pointing to the football and then his hand. "This is stupid. He knows how to play football," said Michael. "Maybe they play it differently in his country. Remember when I got here and I only knew American football?" protested Tom, looking at me as if I knew the answer. I shrugged. "I don't know. We should have asked Mrs. Hemsey." "Oh, come on," cried Josie as we reached the playground. "Let's just let him try and see if he knows it." By the time we had reached our usual corner of the playground, Josie and Tom had decided that the new boy would be on Josie and Michael's team. Since she was the best at football, it wouldn't matter so much if the new boy couldn't play. And because it was just Tom and me on my team, we had the first kick. After less than a minute of the game starting, the new boy began to run and dribble and do lots of tricks with a football that none of us could do yet, and within the first 5 minutes he had scored 2 goals. "Whoa," said Tom. "He's even better than Josie." Suddenly catching Josie's eye, he quickly added, "Or nearly as good, anyway." "Woohoo!" cried out Michael as the new boy flashed past me and Tom and struck another goal. "Woohoo!" By now, a crowd was beginning to gather to watch the game, and I could hear lots of upper graders and lower graders talking and saying things like, "Look, the dangerous kid's been allowed out," and "Does this mean he doesn't have the disease?" and "But the kidnappers will be able to see him from here." I had just heard Jenny tell everyone that she was sure she had heard Miss Sanders say the new boy was a professional footballer when she suddenly cried out, "Ow!" And before we knew what was happening, Brendan the bully and his mates, Liam and Chris, had pushed their way onto our make-believe pitch. Josie looked at me and I looked at Tom, and Tom looked over at the new boy, who was standing next to Michael looking confused. "We want to play," said Brendan the bully, a nasty smile on his face. He walked over to the new boy who had the football and kicked the ball away so hard that it ended up on the other side of the playground. The new boy took a step back. "Go away, Brendan," said Josie bravely. "This is our game and that's my ball." Brendan the bully turned around to look at Josie and she swallowed nervously. But just then his expression changed from mean to sad. I turned around too and saw that Mr. Irons was walking towards us. "What's going on here then?" he asked, his moustache twitching. Mr. Irons is one of the upper school teachers and is famous for being one of the strictest teachers in school and for never, ever smiling. He has a long face, a long nose, long lips, and a large brown bristly moustache that he carries a tiny comb for in the front pocket of his jacket. Everyone knows about the comb because when he thinks no one is looking, he takes it out and combs his moustache with it in short, straight lines. And when he gets very angry, you can hear his nose whistling. If that happens, then you know you're going to get at least 1 detention or be given 100 lines to write. He's also the very worst teacher you can have on break duty because he hates noises, especially happy noises. Whenever he's in the playground, he walks around telling everyone off for laughing too loudly or for making fun sounds. Last year, he made a first-year boy who was playing tag cry by telling him that only pigs squeal, and since the boy was squealing, he must come from a large family of pigs and should spend the rest of break inside. And another time, Mr. Irons gave everyone cheering for Handstand Hannah 100 lines to write for being so loud, even though she was about to beat the world record for the longest handstand in history. Whenever anyone sees Mr. Irons walking towards them, they always play more quietly or move away. But we had been so happy that the new boy was playing with us that we had forgotten we were in a school where there were bullies and teacher bullies. "Please, sir," wailed Brendan the bully. "She won't let me play. I wanted to play, and she said I couldn't." Mr. Irons tutted at Josie. "That's not a very nice thing to do to your friend, is it?" "He's not my friend," said Josie angrily. "And he didn't ask. He came over and kicked our ball away." "Please, sir, and that boy over there told me I couldn't play too," added Brendan the bully, pointing at the new boy and smirking. Mr. Irons looked over at the new boy and then beckoned for him to come over. The new boy looked around and then, realising what he was being asked to do, walked over to where Mr. Irons was standing. "Did you tell this boy he couldn't play with you?" asked Mr. Irons, pointing to Brendan the bully. The new boy looked around again. Everyone else in the playground had stopped what they were doing and were listening to everything that was being said. "Please, sir, Brendan's lying," I cried out, running up behind the new boy. "Yeah," added Michael. "And he's new," I added. "And he doesn't speak. When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. But until then, don't interrupt me again," shouted Mr. Irons. I felt my whole face go red and my tongue swell up in my mouth. I could see Brendan the bully smirking again, but this time at me. "Now, boy," Mr. Irons turned to the new boy, "I'll ask you again. Did you or did you not tell Brendan he couldn't play with you?" The new boy stood rooted to the spot and looked over at us. "But, sir," I burst out, "you don't understand. He can't speak." "Right," shouted Mr. Irons, his nose whistling dangerously. "That's detention for you," he cried out, pointing to me. "And you," he added, pointing to the new boy. "And you," he hissed out, pointing to Michael. "All three of you come see me after school today. Until then, I'm confiscating this ball." Josie watched angrily as Liam handed the ball to Mr. Irons with a grin. As we watched Mr. Irons walk off with the ball under his arm, the bell rang for the end of break. Brendan the bully smiled at us. "See you at lunch then," he said, and ran off. But at lunchtime, the new boy was nowhere to be seen, and at second break, Mrs. Hemsey came out with him, so Brendan the bully stayed away from us. At home time, Tom had to run off to catch the bus because it was one of his brother's birthday. The rest of us decided that instead of going to see Mr. Irons, we would go and find Mrs. Khan to see if she could help us, even though Mrs. Hemsey had already spoken to her about what had happened. We also knew she didn't know the whole story because Mrs. Hemsey hadn't been there. So telling the new boy to follow us, we went and spoke to Mrs. Khan. She listened to us in silence, and then, when we were finished, she shook her head. "Ridiculous," she muttered, and I think she was talking to herself. "Some people just can't see past the end of their own noses." She looked up at us and smiled. "Not to worry, all of you come with me." As we walked to the other side of the school to reach Mr. Irons's classroom, I thought about what Mrs. Khan had said about noses and their ends. I touched my own nose and squashed it down because I didn't ever want to have a nose so big that I couldn't see what was happening at the end of it. That was probably what made Mr. Irons give detentions to people who didn't deserve it. Michael saw me and asked what I was doing, so I told him, but he said my nose was too small and flat to ever get in the way of my eyes, so I didn't have anything to worry about. When we got to Mr. Irons's office, Mrs. Khan told us to wait outside. We couldn't hear anything except a loud buzzing as if there were two giant bumblebees on the other side of the door. But after a minute, Mr. Irons came out and stared down at Michael, the new boy, and me, with his nose thrust in the air. Maybe he was trying to see if we could see past the end of it better that way. He gave Josie her football back and didn't say anything else to us, but from that day on, whenever he saw any of us, his eyes would narrow and his nose would whistle ever so quietly. You don't really need to speak someone else's language to know when they don't like you very much. So even though the new boy couldn't speak many English words then, he knew we had to keep ourselves and Josie's football out of the way of Mr. Irons and his horrible whistling nose. Chapter 8. The Unexpected Adventure. That weekend, I decided I wanted to ask Mum some more of my 11 questions to see if she knew the answers. I waited until Sunday morning arrived because that was when I knew Mum wouldn't be too tired and I could ask her a lot of things, instead of just one or two things. The only problem is I had to be extra patient because every Sunday morning my mum spends at least 1 hour reading the Sunday morning paper. It's not a real Sunday paper because mum never buys them. She says you can buy a whole meal for the price of a Sunday paper these days. So instead, all through the week, she collects 2 of the biggest newspapers from the reference section of the library, and then on Saturday night she brings them all home and gets them ready for the next day. She opens them out at the centre and puts them in order so that Monday's papers are on top and Saturday's papers are on the bottom, and then folds them together like a big book. It's too heavy to hold up and read 12 big newspapers in one go, so Mum always reads it bent over the kitchen table as if she's doing homework. I don't like disturbing Mum when she's reading the paper because she only gets to do it once a week, so I quickly finished my toast and milk and silently stared at her as she finished her breakfast. But grown-ups take an awfully long time eating breakfast when they don't have to go to work, and on this morning, Mum seemed to be moving so slowly that you could hardly call it moving at all. I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock getting louder and louder, and my fingers and legs getting bored of waiting. As soon as Mum took the last bite of her toast, I decided I couldn't wait for her any longer and asked, "Mum, where's Cyria?" The question made her look up at me straight away. "What did you say, darling?" "Just, do you know where Cyria is, Mum?" I said more quietly. My mum pushed up her glasses and looked at me with her head to one side. Then she said, "Cyria is a country very far away from here, my love. Why do you want to know?" I shrugged. "That's where the new boy in our class is from." "Ah," she said, nodding. "Okay, tell you what. Why don't you go and get the atlas book and I'll show you." I nodded and ran to the living room, trying to remember where I had last put the atlas book. It's hard finding a book in our house because we have so many of them. Mum loves collecting old books and reading them again and again. She takes the copies that are out to be thrown away by her library, so you could say she rescues them. The only problem is we don't really have space for any more because our rooms are covered with piles of old books, even the toilet. The atlas book was big and Mum always kept the very big books on the bottom shelf of our bookcase. So I climbed over the back of the sofa and crawled into the narrow gap head first to see if it was there. Luckily it was. I grabbed it and pulled it out. The atlas book is one of the oldest books in the house and is almost half as tall as me and just as heavy. So I dragged it along behind me into the kitchen and placed it with a bang onto the kitchen table. I watched as Mum flipped to the index and then to a page near the middle. "Here you go," she said, turning the map around to show me. "This atlas is a little old, but I don't think the borders have changed that much." I let my finger meet hers where it said the word Cyria in capital letters and looked at the strange shape of the country the new boy had run away from. It looked like a woman yawning and wearing a tiara and whose hair was being blown in the wind, except she was all pointy. "Mum, what fruits do people from Cyria like the most?" I crossed my fingers and toes hoping she would know the answer, because if she did, then I would know the answer to 3 of my original 11 questions. I had found out where the new boy was from and what language he spoke, and as a bonus had seen what his country looked like on a map, and learned that he was good at football. Well, let's see. I don't really know. I guess the same fruits we do, and exotic ones like dates and pomegranates. Your Auntie Selma used to make chicken with pomegranate seeds, remember? I shook my head. Well, it was quite a while ago. It was before your dad had to leave us. But I think the dish she used to make was a Syrian one, or was it Lebanese? I can't remember. But here, you see, she said, pointing to a country next to Syria which had the word Lebanon on it. Lebanon and Syria are right next door to each other, so I guess they must eat the same kind of fruits. Can we ring and ask her? My mum smiled. I can ask her the next time she calls. Remember, she lives here now. And Mum pointed to a much larger country lying above Syria called Turkey. It's a bit far and it'll be expensive to call her right now. But listen, we'll go and see her one day soon, and when we do, you can ask her and Uncle Turgay all about it in person. I nodded but didn't say anything because I suddenly missed my Auntie Selma an awful lot. It's funny how you can go for long bits of time without even thinking of someone and then suddenly feel all wrong because you realise they're not around anymore. I feel like that about my dad sometimes. It feels horrible when I go to bed and realise that I haven't thought about him all day, not even for a minute. but I always remember him at night before I go to sleep, because that's when he used to tell me stories and do funny patterns on my forehead so that it tickled. It's different with my Auntie Selma though, because she's not my real auntie.